All right, so now let's look at some of the terms you may have heard me speak of earlier on earlier slides in terms of when we're speaking about research. I mentioned to you about hypothesis. Understand that this is talking more about those specific testable predictions and about how one factor or a variable could be related to another. In terms of operational definition, this is talking about a precise description of how the variables within a research project or study will be observed and measured. And the example is providing here is talking about how drug abuse might be operationally defined as the number of missed work days due to excessive use of an addictive substance. Statistical significance. This is talking about a statistical statement on how likely this study would be occur by chance or can it be predicted. Now, within everything of psychology, we try our best to uh, stand by a code of ethics. Okay, and what I want to just point out to you was three areas of ethical concerns that we try our best because there have been in the past, unfortunately, in psychology's history, uh, situations in which people who were attempting to learn and have questions answered kind of didn't think about people's rights or dignity in terms of uh, their research. One example, unfortunately, would be the Tuskegee experiment, in which African American males um, were put through a horrendous time in terms of being told that they're receiving penicillin and not receiving it when they were afflicted with syphilis. And we'll talk further about those type of research. But what I wanted to go over right now is just looking at these three areas, and the first one being informed consent. Uh, this is our foundation basically when we're talking about ethics. It's that first research principle that's obtaining an informed consent from all participants before initiating any type of experiment at all. So we would ask participants or make participants be aware of the nature of the study, uh, letting them know any type of significant factors that may influence their willingness or decision to participate. This can include physical risks, discomfort, or unpleasant type of emotional experiences. When we speak about voluntary participation, all participants are voluntary. There's no such thing as us saying you have to. Okay. Um, they should be told, though, that they're free to decline or participate or to withdraw from the research at any time. In terms of when I was speaking about the Tuskegee experiment, that was not the case. People were told that they had to follow the protocols and they had to receive medical attention from those who were doing the experiments. So that's a no-no. And thankfully now we make sure that we do not allow participants to be abused in such manners. Now, here's a question. People think in deception, that it's totally wrong. Well, there are times in research when it may be necessary for deception to be used. Okay, uh, there is a restricted use of deception in debriefing. If participants know the true purpose behind certain studies, they might not respond in the way that they should in a natural manner. They might try to fake good. They may fake bad. So there are times when deception would be used. So therefore, uh, there might be that need to deceive participants as to the actual design of the study. But when we use deception in that manner, there are guidelines that are pertinent to the research that we have to apply to. We have to make sure when there's such restrictions that we include a debriefing for the participants at the end of the experiment, meaning we're going to say what was really the cause and reasoning behind the research project. It's involving explaining those reasons for conducting the research that way. It'll help with clearing up any of the participants' type of misconceptions or questions they might have or concerns they had during the research study. Last but never least, confidentiality. Okay, this is a real important step, not only with research but in other aspects of psychology. But it's where all information that is acquired about the participants during a study is kept private. Okay, so it's not published within anyone's articles or writings. It's usually you would find uh, for example, there might be times I'll upload students requesting for participants for their studies. One of the things we ensure is that they are not using any type of demographic material or any type of information of their participants within their study. That being, most times they won't even know who you are in terms of you'll be assigned a number or a series of numbers so that the only identification we have is that number. Your name or address, nothing would ever go with that. Your responses would not be known by the investigator, knowing that you specifically uh, gave those answers. So we worked very hard to make sure that we maintain confidentiality throughout the studies. We don't want to see anyone compromised in any kind of way. All right, so that was the first area. When we're talking about medical research, if this is a second area, yes, we look into how we treat non-humans. Okay, when we're talking about non-humans, we're meaning animals, and how we utilize animals within medical research. Basically, animals allows us to be able to test on new drugs, being able to develop new surgical procedures as well as methods for relieving pain. In terms of psychological research, animals have been used to help us with significant advances virtually within every aspect of psychology. That would include when we're speaking about the brain and the nervous system. Yes, we have utilized animals for that. In terms of one's health and our stress levels, when we're talking about sensation and perception, our sleep, learning, memory, I mean, the list can go on. But there are gains for animals. Non-human animal research has been able to produce significant gains for animals themselves. For example, by suggesting more natural environments for zoo animals as well as successful breeding techniques for endangered species. There are ethical questions that we have to consider and think about. Use of non-human animals in psychological research, it has been and it still is considered a controversy. Okay. However, in the meantime, psychologists have learned to take great care in handling research animals. They actively started searching for new and better ways to be able to protect research animals uh, during times of an investigation or study. So the third area that we're going to speak about in terms of ethical concerns is respecting the rights of psychotherapy clients. As I mentioned earlier, confidentiality is extremely important. That's why I said last but not least. In terms of one's personal information, and that includes their therapy records, their health records, uh, we have to maintain confidentiality. Only those that we are allowed to provide that information and we would get permission from the client would have access to that information. If we don't have permission, we don't give it. Okay. We're legally required, though, to break confidentiality in certain situations, particularly if someone's threatening to hurt themselves or if they say they're going to hurt someone else. Now, let me kind of expound on this here. If someone told me that they killed someone 10 years ago, I would have to maintain confidentiality. It is not a current situation, although it would be horrific to hear. And I may talk about the person, talk with the person in terms of asking them, well, if they're sharing this with me, do they feel that they need to share this in terms of, justice for the person that they hurt? However, if it was where they said, well, 10 years ago I shot this person and killed them and I never got caught, I can't go to the authorities. Unfortunately, I am bound by confidentiality. Now, if a person came to me in therapy and they expressed that they were really angry at someone and they provided me with a name as well as a plan on how they would kill someone, now I have to break confidentiality. Okay? In terms of children, I'm obligated if I feel that a child is being abused, I'm obligated to report that. I cannot maintain confidentiality. So if I have a parent who shares with me that they beat their child, then yes, I have a duty to warn, and I would have to then report that. Now, I would explain this to a client prior to us starting therapy. I tell them up front that these are the terms of which we will be able to do therapy, that for the most part, I'm going to be confidential, but in those specific circumstances, then I would have to break confidentiality for those reasons. Okay. Last last uh, thing that I would have to also explain is elderly abuse. I mentioned child abuse, but also elderly abuse would be included. So there's a vulnerability act that's kept to the grind here in Mississippi, in which those who are abused by anybody and they're considered vulnerable, they will be brought up on charges. And in that same accord, because of that law, state law that we have, I would have to also oblige in that. Okay, if I find that anyone that's vulnerable, that being somebody that could be intellectually challenged, or demonstrate some type of disability, and I know that my client might be abusing that person, then again, that's another time I might have to break confidentiality. All right, so when we're talking about experimental research, everything we feel there's a cause and effect. When something happens one place in one area, if there's a variable that's interacted in one way, what does it do and how does it make the other variable, or how would your behavior change because of it? So right now, what I want to just go over briefly, and make sure you do read this in your textbook, is the four major type of research methods that we do use when we're doing research. The first one is experimental. This is when we actually manipulate and control the various type of variables that we might interact with. Okay, the reason why we do this is to help us to identify the cause and effect of what trying to explain. That's our goal that we would be looking at. Why it would be happening in the first place. Advantages to this includes us being having precise control over the variables that would allow us to identify the cause as well as how it affects the situation. Disadvantages might include some type of practical limitations depending on the situation. When we're trying to create the perfect environment, we may not be able to do so because other variables may confound the results. Um, there's also dealing with researcher as well as participant biases that can kind of throw a monkey wrench within research. Okay. The next type of research method that we can look at and discuss is descriptive. Now, descriptive is when we're trying to describe that goal. Here we look at observations, we might utilize surveys and look at case studies to help us to be able to observe and collect data that allow us to describe a particular behavior or situation. Advantages here is that this minimizes somewhat that artificial environment that I was speaking of. It allows us to collect data easier, as well as being able to describe that behavior and mental process as it's happening. An example can be I might go to a school if to observe children and how they might react to their teacher or a particular plan that a curriculum that they're learning. That would allow me to do it. Or suppose I have a child that they feel might have attention deficit disorder or ADHD. Then in those situations, I'm able to go to the classroom and do observations in which it allows me to see when the child's demonstrating some hyperactivity or if they're having difficulty attending to things. I can observe to see what's happening at that time that might be causing the behavior to happen. You can also think about if you ever seen anyone else doing on the campus, you might see people going around saying, would you take a few minutes to answer some questions for me? Those surveys, those questionnaires, that's also considered descriptive. Okay? Now, some disadvantages when we're speaking about descriptive can include biases of the participant as well as the researcher. And it's not really identifying the cause and effect. We really don't have much control over it. One of the things that you can, when we're speaking about questionnaires or surveys, you have to worry about self-reporting, whether or not the individual is actually telling the truth or not. We can't control whether or not they would. So that's one of the disadvantages. Now, in terms of correlational, here we're now seeing what the relationship might be between variables. It helps us to identify those different type of relationships, uh, how oil and water and oil don't correspond to one another. I know it's a simple example, but it helps you to get a clear picture. How we'll be able to assess one variable and whether or not it helps us to predict how another variable would react. Advantages. It's giving clarification between those variables that's not easily examined by other methods and would help to allow prediction. Some disadvantages of this, again, there's very little control over the variables and we would have more difficulty doing identification for cause and effect. The fourth one would be biological. Here, this is including studies about the brain and other parts of the nervous system, how they communicate, and so forth. Uh, it'll help us to answer one of all goals within the four goals that we try to abide by. Advantages here is it allows us to share many or all of the advantages of the other three types of research, that being experimental, descriptive, or correlational. We can combine all of it when we're talking about biological because we have demonstrated some of each within it. The disadvantages, just like the advantages, is sharing of all of the above. We might have the same issues that we would have in experimental, descriptive, or correlational. All right, experimental research, this here is the most powerful research method. And I want you to remember that because it'll probably be a test question. The experimental research is the most powerful research method because it allows for the experimenter to manipulate and control the variables. Thereby, it determines cause and effect. Okay? So, lock that into your brain. It carefully controls scientific procedures that allows us to manipulate um, and helps us to determine cause and effect. Okay? Manipulate, control, determine. Lock those three words in your head. Now, in terms of experimental, we have, you've heard me mention variables. Now, there's two types that we work with when we're talking about experimental. We are looking at the independent variable, and this is basically the factor that we would manipulate. When we talk about independent variable, remember the word manipulation links to independent variables. This is what we are allowed. Whereas the dependent variable is the factor that we will be able to measure. Okay? Experimental group. Experimental group means they would actually receive the treatment versus a control group, they're not going to receive any treatment. How's the best way to describe it? If you look at the slides, the slide is going to demonstrate and show a breakdown where it's talking about the hypothesis, it's talking about random assignment, which random assignment, in order to be able to avoid any kind of sample bias, an experimenter would usually randomly assign subjects to two different groups, that being the experimental group, which we give treatment to, or the control group, which do not receive any treatment. Okay. We also have to take a look at the confounding variables. These are extraneous types, such as if we have to contend with the time of day, lighting conditions, we have to take a look at participants' ages or genders. These are those other type of variables that might throw a monkey wrench within our research design, but it must be held constant across the experimental and control groups, okay, so that they do not affect different group results. So we would have to work within those different variables. For example, one way, if we looked at age, we would try to make sure that our age range is similar across the board for all participants. So this is where it's one of those difficult times when we are not together, where I would want you to work in class and practice these. But what I want you to do is take a moment. I want you to pause the video, and I want you to read each scenario, okay? And try to see if you can label what would be the independent variable, which what we do with the independent variable. If you remember, we manipulate that. We actually are allowed to manipulate that particular factor. Be able to label what would be the dependent variable. And again, remember, the dependent variable is what we actually measure, okay? Which one would be the control group? And remember, with the control group, we would not apply any type of treatment to. Um, think about if we were if we were trying to study medications, for example. If we give a medication to a group of people, that's considered to be the experimental group. Whereas if we were not to give them anything but sugar pills, a placebo, that's considered the control group. So I gave you a hint already. As you're reading, you'll kind of see what I'm saying, and hopefully it'll click for you. But take a moment right now, pause the video, and answer these for yourselves, okay? Then you can get started again. Now, when we're doing experiments and we're working in research, there's always some potential issues or problems that can occur. And you heard me mention a couple of them before. But right now, let's look at some of them. Experimental bias. Here, this is when researchers kind of influences their thoughts and their feelings to make the research project go in one direction or the other. That's really not a good way to do research. When we're talking about a single blind study, here this is when the researcher knows what's going on between the experimental group as well as the control group, but but participants don't. There's still potential biases and issues that can go on with that. Double blind studies. Now this is where we want to really see. Singles help, but a double-blind study would be even better, and that's because neither the researcher nor the participant actually know who was placed in the experimental group or who was placed in the control group. So this would be one of those stronger areas that we would want a person to go through. Now, in terms of when we're talking about ethnocentrism, this is when an individual believes their culture is better than above all else's, okay? And one way to help to correct that is to try to do more of cross-cultural studies in which we're doing comparisons of one culture to another to kind of see how relationships would happen. Uh, that would be one way to help solve the problem. But it can be an issue if, for example, I'm doing a study and I believe because I'm African American that I feel that we are above everybody else, then it would skew my thought process on how I would design a project in the first place. It may be where, here's a great example. Historically speaking, within psychology, as we were doing intelligence testing, and you'll learn more in chapters coming ahead, but there was biases throughout because it was geared toward one culture. It was more Eurocentric rather than including the thoughts and the experiences of people of color. Thankfully, that's gotten better. Uh, has it gone away completely? Not entirely, but we have been able to see and have strives in improving in those particular areas. So now, you heard me mention about placebo, and one of the things with placebo, understand again, it's inactive. Think of it like sugar pills. We generally use it as a control, but there have been situations and times when people do better. And you have to ask, well, why do some people get better with just, the sugar pill or just receiving more attention, at least for a little while? This is where you have to think about the power of the mind. And sometimes some individuals need just that. Now, one story I like to share is that long ago, earlier in my 20s, I suffered severely from migraines. I mean, severe. And I went to my physician and I expressed that I was in a lot of pain. And he immediately wrote me a prescription and said, take these and you'll feel better. Well, I was taking these pills and it was doing nothing for me. And I just so happened to had a friend who was a nurse, and I, at that time being young, naive, I had told her, I was like, I got this medication for my headaches, but it's doing nothing. I'm still suffering bad with migraines. So she said, well, let me see your pills. What's your prescription? And I gave it to her, and she started laughing. And I was real upset because I'm like, what's so funny? Well, she said, your doctor apparently feels that your migraines are all within your head as far as it being psychological and not physical. And I said, well, why would you say that? And she said, well, he's prescribed you placebo. And she showed me how to look at the difference and know what makes it recognized as placebo. Well, let me tell you, I went back to my physician and he got cussed out, bottom line. And that was the last time I seen him. Um, he felt that I was pretty much hypochondriac because in my 20s, I didn't like feeling any kind of pain. So anytime I hurt, I went to the doctor. Um, Needless to say, you have to be, I always say, don't trust anybody in terms of your health. Ask questions. If you see that you're still hurting after something, you might want to make sure they're not giving you placebo. But anyway, let me move on. A sample bias. This is happening when research participants, they really are not representing everyone. Now, of course, we can't, when we're doing research, we're not going to be able to say that a study covers the entire United States, for example. But what we do is we attempt to make significant determinations based off the size of our sample. So the larger the population, the better the data can be a representative of. We can't say that it's everybody, but we can say that the majority of the people, based upon our samples, determine and it suggests particular information. As I mentioned before, random assignment. This is where we assign where we don't know is better. Random assignment is considered the best way to assign people to research. If I don't know and they don't know, then we can actually get some real good information from the data. Participate participant biases is occurring when the participants they might try to influence the results based upon their self-report. Like I said before, they might look good. You know, people don't want to show any type of flaws, so they may answer negatively in that regard or aspect. Okay, so the best way to solve these issues, like I mentioned, with sample biases is helping with more using random representation, random assignments. In terms of solutions for participant bias, the less they know, the better. So that's when we talk about deception. Again, though, if we use deception within our study, we have to do what? Immediately debrief the participant at the very end of the study. So say for example you had to do some deception, they go through whatever type of experiment you're doing. As soon as they're finished, you're supposed to explain what they really actually did. Okay, also again, great things to be able to use is those double-blind studies. And in terms of using placebo, they don't know, they will not know whether or not they have placebo or not. So this is again a way to maintain uh, keeping participant bias to a minimum. Now, here I want you to think about this. Will not be part of the assignment. Your first assignment, you're going to have a lot to do already, but stop the video for a moment and take time and just read this and for yourself. One of the things I like for you to do is be able to test yourself to see if you're having a clear understanding. But based upon what we've mentioned, take a moment to see if you can design a specific scientific experiment and answer the questions based upon that. Come up with a topic of your own that you might have and see if you can start to develop one. This is going to help you because down the line, I'm hoping that all of you are going to move forward. You're going to go and graduate, and you're going to go out there. You're going to continue your studies. You might want to get your master's. Well, guess what? Most master's programs will require you to do a thesis. And what is a thesis? It is doing some type of research. So take a moment, read these questions, think about it to yourself, and then you can move forward. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here. I am now testing a theory. I've decided not to do direct uploads of the videos, and I'm going to actually try to upload to YouTube, then to Canvas. So hopefully, I'll be able to do this. This has been a longer one. I'm at the 34-minute mark, and I want to stop because I'm kind of hesitant, and I'm hoping I don't have any problems or issues. But this, when we come back, we'll start looking more at the descriptive type of research.